Thank you so much, Vanessa. All right, so without further ado, let's go ahead and get started. Today's panel is going to be navigating community pushback. We're going to be exploring how prevention educators within sexual violence, educators, community organizers, advocates, how they can navigate the communities that they're working with and collaborating with when there is lack of capacity from the community, pushback on certain topics, right? Hesitancy to embrace what we know is really good prevention, which is inclusive, anti-racist, right? Includes everyone in the full curriculum and the full programming. First, before we get into our discussion, I would love to introduce our panelists. So first up, I'd like to introduce Brian J. He is the co-executive director of GSAFE, a Wisconsin-based advocacy organization that creates just schools for LGBTQ youth in Wisconsin. GSAFE does this by developing the leadership of LGBTQ youth, supporting gay-straight alliances, training educators, advancing educational justice, and deepening racial, gender, trans, and social justice. Brian has formally been with GSAFE since 2002. Next, I'd like to introduce Meghan Benson. She is the Director of Research, Assessment, and Evaluation with Planned Parenthood of Wisconsin. But prior to her current role, Meghan was with Planned Parenthood Wisconsin's Education Department for 15 years. And last, I'd like to introduce La'Tanya Campbell. La'Tanya is a clinical mental health therapist, mentor, consultant, and advocate. Formerly, La'Tanya was the coordinator of the Victim Advocacy Program, where she helped empower victims of violence to become safe, stable, and self-reliant. Her work addressing racism, implicit bias, and systemic oppression began as a means to ensure the safety and self-sufficiency of those she served, combating all forms of institutional oppression while lifting the voice of survivors. Collectively, I would say we've got a panel with fantastic experience, great knowledge. I'm so looking forward to the discussion that we'll have. So just so folks are aware, the plan for today is to go through 5 pre-written questions for our panelists to discuss, all on the idea of how we do our prevention and sexual violence work when we are encountering community pushback. And once we've made our way through those questions, we'd be glad to open it up to the audience if they have questions that they would really like to ask the panelists. If you have any tech needs, any questions, please feel free to reach out to Vanessa Moss, who is one of my wonderful colleagues from WCASA. She is here and will be our tech support, Zoom support, if you will. Feel free to reach out to her if you have any needs throughout the panel. Lovely panelists, are we feeling good to go ahead and get started? Yes, okay, wonderful, thank you so much. So first up, our first question, and I'll put this in the chat for everyone to see. How can sexual violence prevention educators maintain consistent delivery of programming when parents or school administrators are increasingly hostile or outright forbid the teaching of certain topics and terms that are essential to sexual violence prevention? I'll go ahead and put that in the chat because it's the long one. So for instance, right, sexual violence per work is inherently anti-racism work, right? We want it to be inclusive LGBTQ experiences. Some schools and community organizations, though, really want to exclude curriculums that acknowledge the necessity of anti-racism, that acknowledges LGBTQ identities. So how do prevention educators succeed when the conditions for programming has become really restrictive in some spaces? And La'Tanya, I see you've unmuted. Would you like to get us started?
Yes, I would. I was going to ask if everybody could, if it's available to you, if you can turn your cameras on, that would be fabulous. I can't obviously see everybody, but it allows me to be able to see if there's questions, if there is some type of reaction to some of the things that I say so that I can try to address those right away. So if you can and are able to, please turn on your camera. So to answer the question that you have, I think it starts before you want to go into the classroom. I am privileged and that I worked at the women's community for 13 years and in Wausau, and our coordinator of our sexual assault program, Jessica Lind, she built a lot of relationships throughout her tenure before she started going in there trying to educate the students or the parents or the faculty. So I think it definitely starts with building relationships prior to trying to go into school to deliver those important messages. And then I would also say that try to have conversations about the importance of anti-oppression work and how it ties into sexual assault at a level where people want to open up their hearts. Because if they open up their hearts and their minds to what you're saying, they're less defensive to be able to teach the kids what's going on, what healthy relationships look like, what safe touch looks like. That was the first thing that kind of popped into my mind, is building those relationships in and out of the classroom and within the community.
Thank you so much, La'Tanya. I don't think that the importance of those relationships can be emphasized enough, right? Like, it really does come down to that. Megan and Brian, would either of you like to add on to what La'Tanya has shared or offer additional insight?
Well, I will definitely second what La'Tanya said as well. Relationships, I think, are really key. And I think as you're building those relationships, one thing that can be really beneficial is making sure that you are providing an opportunity to really hear from the community. So if you are, working with a school administration, maybe there's a committee, a community committee or a parent committee that's somehow involved in some of this work. When you go in and talk to them and talk about the importance of violence prevention and how anti-oppression work is very much integral to that. Also giving them an opportunity to, ask questions, to share any concerns that they might have. I find that sometimes that's really helpful to say, tell me what your concerns are about me, talking about LGBTQ plus identities. And I think once you get some of that information from them, that can also help tailor your conversation so that you're really addressing like their concerns. Maybe they have some misinformation about the type of education you're providing or what you're talking about. So really taking that time to listen to the concerns and then responding to those as you can.
I was gonna, if you don't mind me adding, there's a lot of buzzwords right now that's nationwide that stops conversations before they get started. Those words create defensiveness and being guarded. So anytime you're saying anti-oppression, you're saying white supremacy, anytime you're saying privilege, you're talking about human trafficking, these are buzzwords that people start going to critical race theory, and they have preconceived notions on what those buzzwords mean and how they show up in the community and impact children. Most of the time they're misinformed, but what I've noticed that if you can deliver some of these messages softly, still directly, but softly without using those buzzwords when not necessary, you're able to get buy-in from the parents, the faculty, and the community. Sometimes, you can't tiptoe around it and you just got to say what you got to say. But if there is a way to soften it without losing the message or your integrity, I would try to soften, use other words outside of what the buzzwords are to try to have those conversations. Sorry to jump in, but I just thought about that.
This is all great, and I'm just absorbing the knowledge being shared right now. My apologies, everybody. I'm at a conference in Denver, Colorado, and I thought I found the quietest corner that I could find in the hotel, and it's lunchtime right now. So people are zooming in and out. So hopefully people can hear me okay, like without too much background noise. So yeah, so thanks. Yeah, I guess like Megan, you had said something that made me think about, because oftentimes a strategy that I'll use, and I work on creating safe and supportive schools for queer and trans students, and oftentimes there's hesitancy or concern, and I appreciate you just asking people, what are you concerned about, right? Because oftentimes you can unpack that, because oftentimes that's based in stereotypes, right? And you can do a little bit of education when there's the chance to do that. Or there's fear, right? And you can work through that, fear and misinformation. And the other thing is that I often find that the people that are the ones that are going to have to answer the questions in the district. You know, the principal, the superintendent, the teacher, or whatever else have you, don't have the skills or the language to talk about, here's why we're doing this. And so helping them gain the language, or here's some helpful talking points that I've found, or hey, and another thought, sorry, I'm a little bit like scatterbrained right now, but another thought that I had based on Megan, what you had suggested, is sometimes it's okay to be like, yeah, hey, I used to have that same concern, or I also or I used to not understand the importance of this or understand this topic. Can I share something with you that was really helpful in helping me kind of grow in my understanding and understanding why this is important, right? So connecting, empathizing, and then offering to share some things that are helpful, I think can be really great. I think, La'Tanya mentioned relationships and just really having those. So I think, absolutely. Some bullets that I wrote down, knowing your district, that you're working with, what are the policies and the politics, just to be clear about what is and isn't allowable, because sometimes you're like, this is just what I have to work with, right? I always like to ask leadership, particularly in places that are restrictive. It's like, all right, you want me here, but they have these restrictions for these, here's some harmful policies that I know are in place. How would you suggest that I navigate that? Partially ask the question to make them squirm. But then personally also, I want to know how they're talking with folks. And if they haven't talked with folks about the policy or their practices, that's a chance to maybe do some education there as well. I also think about, even if we can't deliver in the fullness of what we know is needed, we also know that providing some information is planting seeds. It's being seen so that the people that need to see us or know that this information exists, know that we exist, and providing links or opportunities to connect outside of school possibly. And then I think, and I'll probably keep coming back to this, but the reality is the people that don't want to talk about the history of racism and the oppression of folks of color in our country, the people who don't want to talk about LGBTQ plus topics are also the people who didn't want to wear masks, didn't want to have vaccines, and it's also the people that don't want that are attacking public education, right? And so I think something to recognize is that we're, this is a all hands on deck moment because we're at the worst, right? So some of the things I suggest too is that if you live in that district or in a district, thinking bigger than one presentation, but also how can we affect change in our community, which includes who can we get to run for school board, right? Because school boards are setting policies, and it's it's not time to sit on the sidelines and think, oh, somebody else is going to do that. And maybe gathering 2 or 3 friends and say, hey, let's run together as a slate, because we know that the folks who want to stymie these discussions, that's what they're doing. So I think some of the stuff isn't going to change until we take back school boards, for instance, in Wisconsin. So anyway, that's some thoughts just in my head right off the top.
Thank you so much to all 3 of you. I really feel like what I heard collectively from your voices was just how important the relationship building is and providing the space to hear out what the hesitancy is rooted in. And I loved, La'Tanya, what you said about being direct, but still soft. So dispelling the myths or the misunderstanding around certain terms and finding a way to sort of bridge that understanding. And also, Brian, you naming that there are some forms of community pushback that are maybe rooted in something deeper and more difficult to navigate. And it's the same pushback that we hear around other, both physical and social safety concerns, right? Especially after we've had such a massive public health crisis, right? We are still very much recovering from that. I do feel like it's important for me to name, and I think most folks know this, that funding, when it does come to certain policy advocacy, right, is not something that some of our grants allow for us for, but that doesn't mean, right, I don't want to undermine Brian's point, how vital it still is for us to be involved in our communities and aware of who the decision makers are and who our allies are, right, who have those shared values and who are going to move them forward. Just feel like as WCASA, maybe an important thing to remind folks of just in case, but I don't want to undermine how important that point still is. Thank you all so much. For my next question, we kind of got to this, but it's more about timing now. So in your opinion, is it better for prevention educators to try and get ahead of anticipated pushback by offering the community meetings, question and answer sessions, or should they wait and only engage with pushback if it comes up? Let me put that in the chat for folks to be able to see. So do we get ahead of it, assume that there's going to be hesitancy and try to like dispel that right off the bat, or do we proceed as planned and only get vocal if we are experiencing that really direct pushback or push out? What do folks think? Go ahead, La'Tanya. I see you smiling and I'm muted.
I'm laughing because I'm probably going to get in trouble, but I don't have nobody to get in trouble with. So it is what it is. I would personally ask for forgiveness rather than ask for permission. I want to start from a place of hoping that they're open. Obviously, when we're going into school, we're trying to educate, advocate, we have our mind and the purpose is in the right direction, in our heart. And most of us are using like evidence-based practices to ensure the safety of all. And so we're going in there in the right fashion. We got permission, we're in there. We have evidence-based practices that we're using. I'm gonna go in there and try to educate, support, and do as much as I can before I get that pushback. And then when I get that pushback is when I would want to start. I would go back and be like, okay, let's have some conversations. What is the problem? Like Megan was saying earlier. But I would start from a place of going in there like, of course, everybody wants this education. Everybody knows that it's important for our youth. Everyone wants to keep, all of our kids safe. And I'm going to go from that direction. But that's my thoughts.
All strategies are welcome strategies, La'Tanya. I hear you. Megan and Brian, anything you'd like to add or offer as well?
I can go. I see you pointing, Brian. So yeah, I mean, I agree with La'Tanya because I do think also that like if you're anticipating like something bad is going to happen and you're putting out all of this material or communications, that might actually make people think like, oh, is there something wrong with this? Is there something I should be worried about? Is there something I'm upset with or should be upset about? So yeah, I mean, I think as long as if you're in a school, right, the teacher has maybe invited you in, I think it's never a bad idea just to confirm like, hey, your principal is aware of this, right? Because I have been in situations where I have seen people working directly with the teacher knows what's going on, they're good with everything, but maybe someone in the administration is not aware of what's happening, and then a parent gets mad, and then the poor teacher ends up getting in trouble. So I think making sure within that school in particular, or if you're working with a community organization, just making sure that there are enough folks there, especially folks who wield more power, who have bought in to the program. And then I also think it's never a bad idea to be prepared. So again, maybe not going out and like, messaging to the entire community that you're doing sexual violence prevention at this school, but just knowing that maybe it would be helpful if the teacher had, just a brief, thing that she could send to parents ahead of time. I know, coming from a sex education background, a lot of times there is some sort of, parental guardian consent, maybe passive, but, there's something going on that parents are being made aware of what's happening in the classroom. And so just sort of supporting the teacher and being able to, respond to any questions that may come up from the students, parents, or guardian. But I think, yeah, generally, like if you've built that relationship with the school, if everyone in the school is sort of aware of what's going on and bought in, then hopefully you won't end up with a lot of pushback. I know that varies a lot from community to community, though.
Yes to both what La'Tanya and Megan said, right? Because it's all of those things. I always default to like whoever I'm working with asking questions, like who's bringing me in and asking questions. If I can't immediately tell what the climate is, it's like I'm like, so how are things? where's your school board at? Where's your principal at? You know, if I know, like, for instance, if I'm going to Waukesha, that's going to be some things that I know that I need to think about versus going to Milwaukee or going to Green Bay, because I know different things about those school districts and kind of how they handle different things, right? And I do think always like making sure that you have, for me, I think it's important, especially if you think that you go into a space where it's like, there might be some pushback or I can expect the pushback. I never think it's a bad idea to either prep people ahead of time or like, you know, hey, how are you explaining this? Or do you feel good about responding to questions? And sometimes they're just questions from families, right? They're not like angry, whatever, but they're like, hey, I heard this is happening, or I heard this happen, you know, again, helping the teacher or making sure the teacher knows that the principal feels comfortable being able to respond to questions that might come up or concerns that might come up, particularly after the fact. I definitely agree with La'Tanya. You like, you know, you don't have to ask permission or you don't have to feel it all out ahead of time, because, you know, education has a long history of like do it and then ask for forgiveness later. But the thing is, particularly if you think that you're in a place where it might be more contentious, or, you know, you can read the room. I think it's also important to try to think of how do we maintain that relationship with the school district, as opposed to going in, doing it, and then never getting invited back. Or, you know, for 5-10 years, you don't get invited back, or somebody doesn't get invited back because that same person in charge is like, nope, we did that. Parents got angry. We're never doing that again. So.
Thank you. Thank you, Elsa. Yeah, I really hear that about like proceeding, because this is what the curriculum is, right? As I said at the top, we know that prevention work is anti-racism work. We know that we have to include all experiences and all people in our work. And we don't have to taper that out to bring it to the communities that we're doing, and anticipating potential questions, preparing the spokespeople for how to answer those questions when they come up. And knowing your audience, right? Knowing where they're most likely going to be at in receiving these concepts and these ideas, and knowing maybe where the attitudes lie in the given community or the audience that you're working with. So I'm hearing the combination really of all three. And I want to like parking lot, Brian, something that you brought up after we've gone through the other questions, in the instance where we do have like an all out removal from a certain setting where maybe we've been working for a long time. I would love to pick the three of your brains about like, how do we proceed from there? With that is actually unintentionally a great segue into the next question, which is, what are some of the alternative outreach and prevention program strategies that you'd recommend to educators who are being pushed out of schools? We know that traditionally schools are a really intuitive place for sexual violence prevention work to take place, especially in rural programs that don't necessarily have a lot of other community partner opportunities, right? It's a great place to access young people. We know they're going to schools, and so it feels like a really intuitive fit. What happens if we are in a community where we're no longer to be in that school setting, especially if we're in a rural area or an area that is really dispersed and we don't necessarily have like a YMCA or another local place that would be a good, easy fit to reach young people. So yes, I'll put that again in the chat so everyone can see it. Yes, what are some other strategies and outreach opportunities that the three of you would highlight or want to draw attention to?
Okay, I guess I was trying to see if Megan or Brian was going to go first this time. I think you have to get creative and strategic. There's still other ways to, and it depends on your staffing and what their interests are, what their passions and motivation is. I believe Brian was talking about getting on school boards and things of that nature. You might not be able to do it as an agency because of funding, but if you have employees that are interested, you know, definitely making it accessible and flexible, you know, schedules and things like that you can do to support them in that endeavor. And also in your hiring practice, asking what other people's interests and passions are, and being open and flexible for them to engage in things outside of the agency. So that's one thing. But I would get connected with your local Boys and Girls Club, your shelters, your counselors. See if someone, for me, I started a support group. So we, there's a lot of racism in the school and in the community. And so I started a support group for at-risk youth, so that I couldn't necessarily go to them, in that school setting, but they can come to me and I could provide that supportive services as a group and as an individual. I also did like being strategic with like Black History Month and MLK Day. I had a student-led panel talking about some of the experiences that the youth had in the school and in the community as it pertained to racism, discrimination, and biases. So you can try to get at the youth in those capacities, getting connected with your local pride. Are you guys having a pride month? Are you guys doing something for pride? You can meet people there and pass out information and resources. And hopefully someone in your agency, maybe they'll start a support group for LGBTQ. They'll still start a support group for people of color or whatever your passions are or whatever the needs are. So if you can't get into the school, what can you do out in the community? Who can you partner with in the community? And are you using your journey to be able to uplift and shed light on all of those voices that don't have voices? Are you writing your local papers? Are you making posts on social media? In your signature, do you have she and her when you're introducing yourself? Are you telling what your pronouns and asking what other people's pronouns? In your office space, do you have decor that looks like the people that you're trying to serve and reach? So there's all different kind of ways I think that you can try to bring a voice to people that's traditionally not heard.
Yeah, La'Tanya, I would I loved everything that you said, and I was ready to jump in and go first, so you didn't have to do it again. But I'm like, oh no, the questions are out of order. Which question is being asked? So I had to get to my pre-notes. So I love that you're just right there. So thank you. You know, the I had mentioned social media or thought about social media. You mentioned that. I think about particularly because I think about spaces that are either not connected to schools that are supportive for LGBT youth. In particular, that's my lens. And I am particularly thinking about rural or less big cities. But some things that have been successful for us, and I recognize that sometimes people's history of trauma comes from this, so that's something where you have to navigate. But I think about, are there affirming faith communities in different places around the state? I think about, unexpectedly, in Washburn, Wisconsin, there's this, a church in this really rural area that has a big old pride flag and does a lot of progressive programming. Not that necessarily the young people are connecting with that, but sometimes the adults are connecting with that. And there's some opportunities to build connections there or hold space there. Libraries are always an option, although sometimes libraries have to navigate their library boards. And we know that a lot of effort to clamp down on information is being directed at libraries right now. La'Tanya, I appreciate you. I was thinking, I had written down the word family networks, but informal networks of are there families that want their kids to know about this information, and it's can we work with informal family groups, have a, for the lack of a better word, a house party, or have opportunities for people together to learn a little bit more. Because one, information is being shared, but it's also having an opportunity for families who share a desire to make sure that this information is available to connect with each other. And that actually leads to, people being why isn't this being taught at school? Or why is it hard for this to happen in our school? And that builds maybe some connections that can have an impact further down the road, was another thought that I had. And I don't think I had, and I was thinking, La'Tanya, you mentioned Pride, which I'm oh, duh. I thought about, there's PFLAG chapters around the state, right? PFLAG used to be parents, friends, or parents, families, and friends of lesbian and gays. And I think it's now just parents of queer and trans folks. And I also know that there's networks of families that are particularly support parents of transgender youth around the state. There's Trans Parent Group here in the Madison area. There's a group through Forge in Milwaukee, or at least there has been, and I believe there's something in the Fox Valley as well. But there's those informal networks as well that can be opportunities to plug in, build connections, and build relationships. That's all I got.
And I actually have a very concrete example of having to sort of work around problematic school district policies. So one of my coworkers who lives in like kind of a suburban area near Milwaukee, a very conservative community, I want to say about 10 years ago, their school district decided to implement abstinence only until marriage sex education. The particular curriculum they were using was very, very problematic, harmful, not at all inclusive. I mean, it was just, it was a awful curriculum that the school district tried to implement. And my coworker, who is also has a child, 3 children in the school district at the time, you know, she works for Planned Parenthood as a sex educator. She had a child who was in the school district. There were a few other parents that she was friends with that were also pretty upset that the school board had made this decision to implement this curriculum. And so those parents really organized themselves. And they went to school board meetings to speak up about why they found this switch in sex education programming for their students to be a problem. They actually ran, someone within that parent group actually ran for the school board a couple times, did not win either time, but it was definitely an opportunity to at least raise the issue among the community. And ultimately, when it was very clear that the school district was not going to change, they were not going to stop implementing this harmful curriculum, this group of parents started organizing more parents. They started educating other parents and encouraging them to actually opt their children out of the school district curriculum. And then they implemented a comprehensive community-based sex education curriculum. And they did have to partner with some different organizations. So I do believe they worked with a library as well as some other community organizations. I know increasingly over the years, we've actually had more and more partnerships with faith-based organizations. So Brian, I really appreciate you bringing up churches. There are increasingly a lot of churches that are willing to work with us to share their space. And so, you know, I think parents can be really good allies. I think a lot of times we are concerned about those parents who are going to be those squeaky wheels, who are, you know, going to try to get us kicked out of the schools. And yes, there are those parents, and they are challenging. Although I recently saw some national polling. So again, I get this will be different in every space in Wisconsin, but some national polling that found that overwhelmingly parents trust teachers to do their job and to do it well. And so there are those, even if you're hearing from the parents who are opposed to what you're doing, there are going to be parents in that community who are very supportive of your work. And so finding those parents, kind of organizing them, engaging them, I think can be a really effective practice. And I would also say students themselves. Students have a lot of thoughts about the types of education that they need, about you know, sex education and sexual violence prevention needing to be inclusive and responsive to their needs. And so especially when you're working with like older, you know, high school age students, they oftentimes want to get involved too, and will show up at school board meetings and talk about what is important to them and what they want their education to look like. So I think doing a little bit of that community organization with parents and students themselves can be a really effective tactic. And again, at the end of the day, if you're just not able to do what you need to do in that school, absolutely try to find another venue in the community to offer that education to the students who need it.
Megan, that just made me think of the like students around the country organizing banned book clubs, right? When a school bans a book in their school, they get together and they, outside of the context of school, they read something and be interested to, you know, plant that idea or suggest that as an alternate. You know, it's like there's different ways that you can get this information that doesn't rely on you having to scour the internet and maybe get bad information, right? So anyway, that was a thought that just triggered in my head.
Thank you all so much. I feel this thread through all the questions so far really underlining how much the relationships that you're building with the different community partners really comes into play here. And that can include, right, like informal community partners, right, like a group of parents, a group of allies who are running like a support space, and in communities where you maybe don't have so many other orgs to necessarily connect with. What about like restaurants, the city pool, right? How do we get creative and bring other prevention opportunities and messaging, both to young people and to the community that they live in, right? One of our close partners with the Safeguard Network, Haley, led a great example where she had small groups think of different ways to do prevention messaging, like with your local city's pool or something, right? And a lot of people had great ideas about doing like a family movie night where you put up a big projector screen and people can like sit in their floaties and watch a movie. Maybe you facilitate a discussion afterwards, or think of different ways to reach young people, to reach families, and to bring in that positive prevention messaging. Coffee houses, yes, Brian, yes, there's truly, right, there's allies and supporters in unsuspecting places. Yes, La'Tanya, the YWCA and YMCA, definitely. So really getting creative and thinking about where are other places we can reach folks. I love what you all said about faith-based places. I can really appreciate how for many, there's some genuine hesitancy in engaging with those partners, and I appreciate that caution, but that doesn't necessarily mean, right, that all faith-based organizations or places are going to be resistant to this. We might find that many are very embracing of it and want to be that haven in their community. So getting creative and thinking about where you are building those relationships, which takes time, like true trust and rapport, true relationship building takes time, which can be really tricky in our field when sometimes we feel urgency. But that's what really matters, right? Is finding those partnerships and building that rapport and that trust with one another. Megan Murray. Oh, thank you, Megan. Yeah, most cities have a Parks and Recs department that offers school-age summer programs. Brilliant, brilliant, right? So again, getting creative and thinking about all the different places that we might reach out to do this partnership, to do this work. All right, another question for our panelists here. Going back to the idea of, okay, pushback is happening. We have maybe vocal resistance from a subgroup, whether that's parents, whether that's school board members. What should prevention educators focus on in their response? Do we want to engage just the allies, the decision makers, those who are feeling the most resistant? What do you recommend prevention educators focus on when that happens? And I'll go ahead and put that in the chat. So are we focusing on decision makers, our supporters and allies, just those who are feeling especially angry or upset about our programming? Or is it probably a combination of all three? I imagine that it's probably all three. How would you navigate this and how would you reach these different audiences?
I can jump in. And Sarah, yeah, I would agree. It probably is engaging a lot of different groups around the community. And certainly the decision makers need to be engaged because they're the ones that are ultimately making the decision about like whether your programming is allowed in a school. However, those decision makers are going to respond to the input and feedback they're getting from the community, in particular parents and hopefully students as well. So again, I think that's a really good opportunity to engage those parents and students that are supportive. I do think there can absolutely be an opportunity for folks who maybe aren't sure how they feel, right? They're like, well, okay, sexual violence prevention seems important. And, you know, I'm hearing from my neighbor that this is really bad for some reason, you know, and maybe I'm not quite sure where I really stand, but I'm hearing a lot of noise. And so that could be an opportunity to, yeah, like have a community meeting or have a meeting with parents and guardians who really want to learn more and want to understand what you're doing. That's also just a great practice as well, because we know that young people need multiple levels of support, right? It's great that they're in a safe and supportive school, but we also need them to be going home and having good conversations there. So that can be a really great time to kind of bring those two pieces together. I would be cautious with trying to sway people who are very set in one perspective, one opinion, and you're going to know who those people are. There are just going to be those people who do not want to listen to you. They do not want to have a conversation with you. There is no way you're going to move them. And so really like focusing on those people as probably not going to be the best use of your energy and resources. And could also very much, be harmful to you, right? Because those are the people who are going to say really hurtful, harmful things. And maybe that's just a space that you don't need to be in. So yeah, work on the folks who you maybe can move a little bit. And it's okay to leave some people behind. Everyone is not going to be on board, and that is okay. But yeah, trying to get a good coalition of folks who can be supportive to hopefully kind of drown out some of those more extreme voices that might be preventing you from doing your work.
Yeah, I was thinking about like the question of, should we focus on the administrators? And I mean, the answer is it depends on what kind of relationship we have with them. And also, if we think about the decision makers, whether it's an administrator or whatever, like if you power map, you try to figure out who has the relationship with them. And it might be, I don't have the relationship with them, but this person does have the relationship with them. And so let me work with them and have them be the messenger or be the one that works on them. Because you're not going to have that relationship all the time. And sometimes, I know that there's places around the state where they're like, oh, there's that Brian J., that professional gay pushing his gay agenda all the time, right? So, I can't be, I'm not always the messenger, but there might be other people who do that, and trying to figure out who those folks are can be really helpful. And again, I think, if there are some movable people, the parents that are reaching out to the schools with questions or concerns, but not just straight up like, nope, don't want this. I do think those are movable. And again, is it the administrator that's going to have an impact on them? Is it a teacher that's going to have an impact on them? Or if it's you having direct communications with them, you kind of have to figure that out again, who's the best messenger. And as always, the choir needs rehearsal, right? So like the people that are on board with you, it's like, it's never bad to work with them, never bad. It's always important to help them feel strong and feel righteous in being able to say, yes, our students deserve this, they need this, even if their families don't think that they need this. So anyway, that's some thoughts. La'Tanya, I don't know what you're thinking.
Well, I agree with both of you guys. So just a little bit of, I guess, self-disclosure in my, personally and professionally. I was on the Marathon County Diversity Affairs Commission here in Wausau, and our job was to shed light on some of the obstacles marginalized communities face, bring it to the attention, educate the county board to pull in the community, right? And so when I was on the board, that was the purpose, or at least that's what they said the purpose or intent of the board was. So right after like the George Floyd incident, and there was a lot of civil unrest going on, we decided to write a resolution, basically just telling all marginalized populations, people with disabilities, LGBTQ, people of color, women, people with lower socioeconomic, so all marginalized communities, that we see them, we hear them, we want them, we accept them, and they belong in the community. And so in my work, there were some county board members that didn't agree with that resolution, and ultimately, it went for a vote and they voted it down for the community. But the city then ended up passing it, mostly after a New York Times article came out, but that's neither here nor there. The city ended up proclaiming it, but the actual resolution was denied. Now, out of that, right? So our resolution ended up not going through, but out of that, there were some grassroots organizations that were created. There were some other people that started doing the work outside of that core committee. In fact, they actually disbanded the committee when the new county board came on. But there started being signs up in front of people's homes, signs that with other marginalized communities know that they're safe, know that if something happened, like if I'm going for a walker and my heart is going out, if you have a sign in front of your house, at least I know as a Black woman that that house is safe for me to go to if I need help. And so I want to say, you want to definitely pull in your community partners, your allies. See, divvy it up the work. See who's got expertise in what field, who knows who, right? But also I know that there was a lot of conversations behind the scenes happening in the community with the group as a whole. And so that sparked up a lot of conversation that started, like, I guess I'm not really a politic person, but there's a lot of politics. You vote for this, I vote for that, but there was conversations being had that had not been had. There were seeds being planted that not have been planted. I wouldn't waste my time, like Megan said, on those people that are very like hateful naysayers that are just going to argue with you and not even make any sense. Some people, have that cognitive dissonance, but then there were some people that basically turn the resolution into a black and white thing, start talking about abortions and exterminating babies. And I was sitting in there like I was in a twilight zone because it don't say none of that in this paper. I'm confused. So when you confused about their argument, just stop talking because they're not going to make any sense. I would definitely still try to work with the educators and see if you can do some training to them before you open it up to the kids. I've done that as well, telling them, what are the vast points that you're getting at? See if you can plant some seeds of change, even if they don't let you go back into the school. Some of those teachers are going to hear what you're saying, some of that faculty and administrator, and then that's going to go out and trickle down to other people. So you might not actually see your work being done. You might not see a change, and anti-oppression work is slow as hell. Yes, I said hell, and I know we're being recorded. It's slow. And oftentimes I'm like, I already know this isn't going to change in my lifetime. This is not going to change in my kids' lifetime, but I have a 4 and 2-year-old grandchildren. I'm hoping and praying that it changes by their lifetime. And so I want to say that whether you're talking to the naysayers, the faculty, or your supporters, the most important thing you can do, honestly, is take care of yourself. Take care of your own mental well-being. Keep finding things to pour into yourself because the work is draining. And so getting together your group of people that can help lift each other up when you're feeling like you're in quicksand and you're drowning fast. That's going to be the most hugest thing that you can do so that you can stay in the fight, regardless of what level it is, and be okay when you need to step back.
Thank you so much, La'Tanya and Brian and Megan. Megan, that sentence, like, it's okay to leave some people behind, keeps ringing through my head over and over, and feels like the perfect dovetail for La'Tanya's point about how incredibly crucial it is that we are taking care of ourselves and knowing where our capacity lies and where our limits are, not just for the sake of the work, but for the sake of our own emotional and mental safety. This is not easy work. And not only is the relationship building itself an investment of your time, of your energy, of your heart, right? Receiving pushback and navigating pushback also requires us to be mindful and to take our time with ourselves and to make sure that we are still being cautious and taking care of ourselves and our community, those who are in the fight with us. I also know, right, that one of the tenets of white supremacy culture is the sense of urgency. So I feel like it's worth underlining La'Tanya's point that this work is done slowly over time. And maybe that feels antithetical to the work of sexual violence. Maybe we're used to answering crisis calls and helping survivors in the moment, but we know that prevention, meaningful prevention happening at the community and societal level happens with time, right? We are changing our social environment, our social fabric. And that unfortunately isn't a flip that we can just switch, right? It's the investment of our hearts, of our time, and what we put into those community relationships. And La'Tanya, you kind of already started us off with this last question. So just to bring it all back for folks, what would the three of you suggest for self-care tips for sexual violence prevention educators, especially sexual violence prevention educators who are survivors themselves, who are LGBTQ, who are Black, Indigenous, Latinx, Asian, who are disabled, right? The folks who are oftentimes the most scrutinized and experience the most oppression and form of hostility and violence from larger communities? How do we care for ourselves in this work? What do you recommend?
I recommend, if you identify in a marginalized community, I strongly recommend that you get a group of other marginalized people and have these conversations. Now, most of the people I see on here looks like they probably identify as white. You know, you can have your safe place as well, but it's so many layers when you in intersections when you're in a marginalized community, that you need a safe place where you can be open and have those conversations. You don't feel like you got a code switch. You don't have to explain stuff that people already get. I say, us Black women, we can just look at each other and most of the time we know what we're thinking and we're on the same page. You need that space when you're trying to heal from all the trauma that you're exposed to. And better believe, doing anti-oppression work is exposing yourself to more trauma. Doing gender-based violent work is exposing yourself. Even if you are doing the training, right? There are questions, and just the material in itself is constantly exposing yourself to it. So if you can limit your exposure to it in other capacities, like I frequently take vacations from Facebook and Instagram. I never was a Twitter person, and I don't know how to Snapchat, or what is that this is another thing that everybody's doing that I don't know how to do.
TikTok?
But yeah, TikTok, that's what it is. My kids forever walking around TikTok and I don't get it, but okay. So taking breaks from social, even the news, what you're watching, you know, try to keep purposefully and intentionally schedule things to pour back into yourself where you're able to be present. Even small things like washing your hands with, you know, that sugar scrub stuff, and put a little bit of essential oils, because the texture of it while you're washing your hands brings you back to the present. Try to eat a meal without watching TV or dingling on your phone. As much as you can, try to be present so you're not on the past, not on the present. Get you a good mental health therapist. Everybody needs a therapist, a good set of people, and take breaks. Be kind to yourself and give yourself grace.
I would, the first thing that I had written in response to this question is to remember it's a marathon, right? And so, and people have already tested that. La'Tanya, you had said that. So, but again, you have to take you do have to take the bigger picture and recognize it's a process. We're not gonna thinking 5 or 10 years out as far as the work that we're doing. Some other things that hasn't already been said, I'm thinking about, as you're doing the work, remembering not to travel or train alone as much as possible, right? Bring somebody that might have a different identity with you or than you with you if you're able to, and work present together if you have that capacity, because then you don't have to share the weight of all the things that come up, especially if people say dumbass things about your own identity or identity close to you, and that other person can negotiate that ahead of time and say, hey, if something comes up, right? Like when I go out and train with my colleagues, I work at a majority people of color organizations, before we go out, I'm the old white guy in the room. It's like, do you want me to feel that, or do you not want me to feel that, and negotiate that ahead of time, and then being ready to step up. The other thing that I thought about is, arranging allies, even if it's just classroom teachers who will speak up, redirect if when needed. And I was thinking about when you're in the moment in training or teaching, again, prepping people ahead of time so that you don't, even though you're the teacher or you're the trainer, having other people that feel empowered and have the responsibility to interrupt or to offer some gentle but firm education if weird stuff comes up while you're doing the work that you're doing, if that makes sense. And everything else I wrote down what Tommy had already said.
And I absolutely agree with everything that La'Tanya and Brian just said. And just to add sort of another layer to this perspective, Self-care is so important. I hope that folks have spent some time thinking about what self-care looks like for you, because it's also a very individualized thing, right? Like some people like to exercise, some people like to binge watch streaming services. You know, everybody has a different routine for self-care. And so hopefully everyone has that opportunity to sort of think like, what do I need to do for myself? I also think there is a role for supervisors, leaders, organizations to be playing in this, right? The onus of self-care should not always fall on the individual. We need to make sure that individuals are working within environments where, like, you have paid time off and paid, you know, family and medical leave, and you have supervisors who are encouraging you to take that time to do what you need, that you do have someone to go to. Like if you end up in a tough spot, or, you know, something is said in the classroom that is really hurtful or harmful to you, making sure you have that support system when you are going back to your workplace, your team. So for those of you who are, you know, supervisors and organizational leaders, just sort of thinking what your role in individual self-care needs to be. And then I think also showing up for your team members and in the ways that they ask you to. So I know, you know, as someone with a lot of privileged identities, you know, straight, cisgender, white woman, you know, there are times where I need to be somewhere, I need to say something, and not in like a paternalistic way of like protecting my colleagues, but when they ask me to be there, to stand up, to speak out, I really need to be willing to put myself in that place and leverage that privilege that I do have.
That reminds me, Megan, that WCASA has sort of the same structure built in. We have certain SAVIS sessions, our advocacy school, where we know we want to start it off with a clear message from one of our white team members, and oftentimes one of our leaders, right, being really vocal about what we expect of the audience, because we're going to give our time and our respect to the expertise that is being shared, often by one of our Black colleagues, by an Indigenous colleague. And that's purposeful, right? Not the paternalism, right? But because we've been asked to be there and to have accountability to show up for our team members and to create a space where we can all be ourselves, show up fully as ourselves and do our work and our education in the way that we are hoping to have meaningful discussion. Awesome. Yeah, go ahead, Brian.
Briefly add on, I'm like, oh, Megan, I'd like your message to people who are supervisors or maybe have the capacity to control the schedule. It was just last month with Pride Month, right? And so I'm just using an analogy. So exhausting for our office, right? Just intense. And what we did, my co-director and I decided let's close the office the first week of July, because even though there's things that we couldn't get to in June because there was so much going on, we were burnt out, right? Collectively burnt out. And I think if you have the capacity to close your office and just say, hey, this isn't PTO, this is like we're closing the office for us to recharge. That's really important. If you don't have the authority to do that, or if you're not sure if you have the authority to do it, click on it anyway. Because I think, you know, it's not the only answer, but I think just recognizing that sometimes we just collectively need that time to be like, this has been really intense and we need to go do what we need to do to get to where we need to be so that we can actually keep doing the work when we come back refreshed, as opposed to just slogging through it. So I say that knowing that I don't do that very well, but it's like, it's important to name it.
Love that, Brian. Truly, thank you so much. What I would really like to do now, first, thank all three of you so much for your wisdom and your insight on those questions. I'd like to hand things over to the audience. If anyone has questions for La'Tanya, Brian, or Megan, you are welcome to unmute. You are welcome to use the chat, but this is the space where we'd like to turn it over to you all. If you've got any burning questions about your prevention work and want to ask these three experts, this is your chance. This is your opportunity, and we'd love to hear from you.
I also know that it's sometimes hard to ask questions when you know that we're being recorded. So I've encouraged folks to also drop questions in the chat or whatever, you know, like I've done enough school trainings that once the recording is off, people are like, oh, I have questions.
Yes, that is a very good point, Brian. Yes, please feel free to use the chat to ask questions, or just if you want to like express exhaustion because this work is really hard, right? And you're in a space where there's camaraderie and a shared experience of experiencing push out or push back. Oh, thank you, Kelsey. Yes, Jess, yeah, this is really hard. Something that the panelists and I were talking about before today's session started was how we sort of hoped that the audience, that all of you would be in a space to receive the discussion as it is, because we know how tempting it is to want like a perfect answer. Like, here's a list of steps, do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and you will win over your community and you won't experience any issues anymore in your relationships, going into schools, reaching young people, reaching families, building new partnerships with non-traditional organizations. And that list doesn't exist. There isn't a perfect map or a perfect list of steps to follow. It's a lot more complicated than that. And we appreciate how in our line of work, that can feel really overwhelming. The sexual violence work is already incredibly heavy and demands a lot from us, whether we're working on prevention or we're working on advocacy. And I know it's not necessarily the answer that we hope for, but it's the truth, right? The truth that this is an investment of ourselves. And there isn't a perfect answer, which also means that we have the opportunity to be creative, right? It also means that there's a chance to really build something new and to get creative and work in meaningful collaboration. La'Tanya, I saw you unmuted. I want to make sure you get a chance to share.
I was thinking, one thing I struggled with was measuring my success. When did I feel like my goal was accomplished, right? Because most of us doing gender-based violence work, anti-oppression work, we want to eradicate violence in all of its forms. But I mean, that's nothing that you can actually touch. It's not really tangible. So what is your goal on something you can actually control? What is within your control? Is it, just at least being able to talk to one person? Is it, really looking at what that goal is to measure your success? So on days when you feel like you're not getting anything done, you can go back to that and be like, okay, I am actually doing this. My goal was to, at least plant a seed. I've talked to such and such amount of people, but I found that to be helpful.
Thank you so much, La'Tanya. That also feels really empowering, like a good reminder, right? That like the results, quote unquote, aren't necessarily what we think they are, but we should still be measuring our accomplishments and our success. I really love that. We do have a question here. Okay, a couple questions. So first one that I'll share, do any of you have tips on engaging with new teachers? We often try to do an introductory email, but any other ways that you think would be worth using to connect? Also, this person is in Waukesha. And so if you're from Wisconsin, that probably brings up a certain feeling in terms of some of the shared obstacles that folks might run into in that community.
Well, I don't have a complete answer, but I also just wanted to surface that, it's really easy. Like, we often will use shorthand about here's a district that's challenging, here's a district that's pretty easy. But the reality is there's amazing educators, amazing parents and students in Waukesha organizing, like the Alliance for Education in Waukesha is a great resource to connect with if you're not connected with that. And obviously in Madison, where I work, there's some, there's been this lawsuits from families that don't want certain things taught in the school, right? So I just wanted to give some love to Waukesha. And if you're not connected with the Alliance for Education in Waukesha, that'd be a really great resource for you.
Thanks, Brian. I saw La'Tanya shared Lunch or Coffee Connect. Yeah, something that occurs to me both is for community outreach and for prevention is like sometimes working non-traditional hours. So do we have time in our day to go over to the school and like during a half day, right? Do we know what the schedule is so that we can connect with educators when they have free time or when they have scheduled time to connect with community members. And that might require us to like get flexible with what we assume should be a 9 to 5 work day, right? So maybe we're working non-traditional hours to try to find other ways to connect with these partners. Anything else to add on that about connecting with new teachers specifically?
I would just add that using your existing networks. So, you know, if you're already working with one teacher in a school district, they may, you know, have connections with newer teachers that you could kind of, you know, like, hey, can you do a warm handoff to this new teacher? The other thing is, if you do have a heads up, and I know unfortunately we have had a lot of teachers leaving their field in recent years, but if you know that a teacher is leaving or maybe they're retiring, you know, really intentionally asking them like, hey, can you just be sure to connect me with the person who's coming in and taking over your class? You know, I know that doesn't always work with timing, but just as, you know, you use those existing networks of teachers and administrators and parents to help make those connections, especially if someone like isn't responding to that intro email that you sent.
Great tips. Thank you all so much. 2 more questions that are very closely related. So first one, would love your thoughts on best strategies navigating strong pushback from surprise adults, in quotations, when we're presenting in schools. So for instance, there's a teacher who is shadowing and standing in the space, admin, substitutes, and closely related to that, how should folks navigate vocal students who during the presentation have a lot of pushback, whether we're talking about consent, whether we're talking about LGBTQ. So part one is like what happens when we have an unexpected adult in the space, and number 2, what happens when one of our participants is really pushing back against the anti-oppression content that we're trying to promote.
So I've had this from students because I work with a leadership group here, and I do some very generalized overview of anti-oppression training with them. And I've had students say that my presentation was biased. I've actually had adults say that too. Neither here nor there. So obviously there's some pushback in there. I try to ask what their concern is, what level, what do they know, you know, what is missing. I try to help them connect. But what I do first when I start presentation is I tell people to pay attention to their body when they start experiencing some emotional distress. And I tell them to write down what it is that I said at that time, because that's going to be an area that they want to go back and research and study. You know, and I explain that emotional intelligence. And so when they get stimulated from something I say and they have pushback in the presentation, I generally remind them of what I said at the beginning. I also let them know that, you know, it is normal to have feelings of shame, guilt, you know, frustration and defensiveness. And that's human nature. And I welcome that, you know, and I encourage it because that's going to be areas in which we can all learn and grow from. So I try to come at it preventative, let them know that it's going to happen and what they can do, you know, to resolve it. And then if it's getting too heated, I'll just be quiet and try to reach them after the fact.
Thank you so much, La'Tanya. Don't know, Megan or Brian, if you had anything you wanted to share. Oh, go ahead, Brian.
Oh, well, I was going to say, Megan, do you have but I could also, you know, I definitely, you know, I think when it's a surprise adult, Aiden, I appreciate you asking that question. You know, we're there to, like, almost always we're probably, you know, if we're in a classroom, we're there to provide education for students and provide students an educational opportunity, right? And La'Tanya, I appreciate the prevention or the setting up that you do, which I'm like, oh yeah, right. I think it's really important to like maybe share some group norms or, you know, however we're going to navigate things. But, you know, I do occasionally have it. It's not always surprise adults, but it's just folks that have infiltrated a space that I've been in, and they're like, I need to voice my strong opposition. And, you know, I think if I'm in schools, I remind people that, you know, we all have, as individuals, we all have a right to have a lot of different opinions, right? We're all bringing a lot of different thoughts and perspectives on any given topic into school, right? So it's like, because we're people, right? Whether we're the teachers or whether we're the students, whether we're a guest parent or whatever else have you. And then I acknowledge that and say that's really important, that's really crucial, and that's not something that I'm here to say you can't have. But today, what I want to remind, especially the adults in the room, is that we have a professional responsibility to make sure that at a minimum, we're working to make sure students feel safe in school. And some of the things that we're talking about today are the things that keep students safe in school. And I'm more than happy to have a conversation with you after this training, but really I want to stay focused on the things that keep students safe, and center their questions. It's kind of like telling them to F off without being harsh in the words, right? So, and I think that, if you've got somebody that keeps pushing, like I was just in community education, so it was mostly adults in the room, but somebody just kept pushing, and it was clear that they wanted me to give them an answer that I wasn't able to give. And so, after maybe about a minute, I said, it sounds like you've got a lot of, it sounds like you've got concerns. It seems like I'm not going to be able to answer the question in the way that you need me to answer the question. So I hear you, I hear that. And I want us to keep moving on. But again, let's circle back later. And then they got angry and left the room. But that was the strategy that I took. I don't know if folks have had other experiences like that or other thoughts.
Yeah, I would second exactly what you said, Brian. I do think there is room to have some compassion and empathy there, and to say that, we all may have different, beliefs and values that we're bringing into this space. And at the same time, I think it's really important that you're also firmly shutting down comments that are going to be harmful to other folks who are in the room. And I acknowledge there's a very fine balance when you're trying to do that. I appreciate what Brian said, especially with adults in the room, to say, you know what, this isn't about you, this is about the students. If you would like to have a conversation after class, I can stay and do that. I think that's a great approach for those surprise adults. But you don't always have that opportunity with students. And so just naming that, yes, we all have different beliefs. What you have just shared could be hurtful or harmful to other students in this room. And so we need to not talk like that in this space, and move on with what we are talking about, which again, I get is not always the solution we want, but sometimes we just have to find that balance, especially when you're in a group of students who may have very different beliefs and feelings and identities and experiences and all of that.
Yes, I think oh, please go ahead.
No, go ahead. Well, I was going to say, almost every school district is going to have somewhere in their mission or whatever, some value or expectations of people being respectful of each other. And so sometimes I often will try to also bring it back, especially with students. It's we get to have our different beliefs, but at school we have the expectation that we're going to be respectful in the way that we share those beliefs and articulate those beliefs. And you can definitely talk about, maybe this is how I feel about things, but we need to be really thoughtful and be really respectful about how we share what we want to say, right? Because we do have the expectation that we're going to be respectful of each other here. So that was just to add on. But Sarah, I cut you off. My apologies.
No, I mean, what you said perfectly captured just what I was going to share. I remember attending a training with Advocates for Youth. They are the authors behind the 3 R's, rights, respect, responsibility. And what I appreciate in that training was them emphasizing when we have, whether it's a well-intended question or if it's a purposefully, we can suspect, right, maybe misguiding question or comment, name it. Right, it's better to name it than to just let that moment pass, because we don't want the audience members who are hurt or impacted by that comment to feel neglected and left out and to shut down. And we can name it without it being inflammatory, right? We can be direct about the expectations of respect and safety for everyone in the space without it being an inflammatory or really like shutdown comment. So I love what La'Tanya, Megan, and Brian highlighted of holding the expectation of accountability and respect in the space, making sure that we are centering everyone, right, those who are most marginalized in the space, and that we are holding everyone accountable to that expectation of respect. Again, that can be really uncomfortable, but better to name it and to bring us back to the content than to sort of let something really harmful linger in the air and potentially cause distress or shutdown amongst other audience members.
And Sarah? Yeah, no, I just had one other thing that sort of made me have an additional thought around this conversation.
Yeah.
I think there's also an opportunity for modeling here. None of us are perfect. We are going to slip up. I've been doing sex education for 25 years, and I've had to make a lot of changes in my language over time, which has been a process for me. So, you know, making my language more gender inclusive, trying to you know, weed out the ableist language that I use, or you know, things like that. And it's a process. And there are times that I do slip up when I'm talking to people. Sometimes I catch myself, sometimes someone in the room catches me. And that's also an opportunity to model kind of recovery after something like that happens. And so to apologize, like, I'm really sorry I said that. I understand how that could be harmful, and I'm going to work on being better with, you know, my language around this particular topic. So also just acknowledging it's not always the other people in the room, that sometimes we can do that too.
Oh, such a good reminder, Megan. Thank you. Yes, I love that reminder. And I love that being the opportunity for modeling too. That's so great. We're at 2:20, so we're coming up on the conclusion of the panel. I want to make sure that if anyone has anything else they'd like to ask or anything they'd like to share, that they get the chance to do so.
I have a question.
Go ahead, Emily.
I was wondering, I loved the line about, like, there are some people you're going to kind of have to leave behind. I think that's really hard for us because we don't ever want to give up an opportunity. And that being said, there was a school district we worked with that was a religious school, and a few parents, or actually it was one set of parents saw the examples that were LGBTQ plus inclusive examples and went to the principal and was like, remove all like mention of LGBTQ plus folks, or you can't teach this here. And it drew a hard line in the sand. And we were like, we're not willing to erase an entire group of people, especially with the harm that we've caused, you know, ourselves over the years. So we ended up leaving that school. But then not too long after that, there was an incident within the school that was super harmful. And they asked us back in a different capacity to come talk about kindness. And I was like, this is sexual assault. This is like harassment. This is really harmful stuff. And you want us to come talk about kindness? Like, we should be teaching our programming and talking to your teeth. Like, it was just like this really tough thing of how do we then reconcile that? Or, you know, we didn't even get the chance to try and be like, do you want to opt out then? If this is one vocal, you know, a few vocal voices, like we've got a lot of people who kind of chime in for everybody and make decisions that maybe not everyone agrees with. So how, you know, thinking about that through of like, yes, it's sometimes we have to let go of things, but also if you're seeing harm being caused and you're seeing these things, like how do we then navigate that and kind of and work around that and show why this is important and why we need to do that kind of when they're just kind of shutting that down too.
I would say any capacity that you're able to be in the schools, you know, try to be there, you know, because that's going to help build their relationships. That's also going to let the students know that they're not alone and they're going to see you. And if there's any way at all you can provide some supportive services for those students outside of the school, I would continue to do that. I mean, I struggle with what you said because I'm a person that's either all in or I'm not. I go all in or I don't go. So it's kind of have to do. Sometimes it's really hard to navigate that halfway space, especially if they're not being transparent in where they're at with things and you see harm is being done. Try to provide that support on other ways and to be there and build those relationships as much as you can. Knowing that each relationship you built with one person, it trickles down and hopefully plants some seeds in other people. The left behind, it's not really you left them, is that they turned and went a different journey. You were there, you are available. You didn't leave them. It's that they decided to go a different direction.
That was so beautifully said, La'Tanya. Thank you so much.
I was going to say too, first, if anyone's an educator or a teacher here, I appreciate you. I commend you. I don't know how you do your job, even though I do therapy for kids. I couldn't do third and fourth, fifth grade. I couldn't do none of the grades. So I just want to say thank you. But I know that when you're working with, a lot of times you don't know who a survivor is. And when you're working with teachers or administrators, and a lot of the times the one that wants to work with us have some history. Most of the time, that's why they want to be able to bring that and teach and educate and support other people because they've been through it. But what we don't see is how they get treated within those schools on the back end. We leave those schools and go back to our offices, but how are their peers, showing up for them? Are they being ostracized? Are they being even further triggered? And so it might not necessarily be the person that we are working with. It might be other people on the back end. And so just also trying to be a support for the allies that we have made within those schools, because they're also feeling helpless and hopeless and getting it from every direction. So really try to extend that grace.
Thank you so much, La'Tanya. I do want to make sure that I'm not missing any questions. There's one more question for you all. Okay. Any advice on how we control our own emotions in responding to pushback in a face-to-face situation? I have a knee-jerk reaction of crying and stumbling over my words when feeling frustrated and angry. This hasn't occurred in my work life yet, but I feel like it's only a matter of time.
Find some folks in practice, like field the hard questions and figure out like how you're going to respond to them is helpful. Like that might feel simple, but that can be helpful.
Yeah, absolutely agreed, Brian. And this is probably a really basic one, but I always think it's helpful to just know that you don't need to respond like immediately. Like if someone says something and it kind of takes you back, like take a minute, like take a few deep breaths, count to 10. And I also just want to connect this to the comment that Stephanie made in the chat. And Stephanie, I really appreciate you lifting that you are a wheelchair user. And so physically leaving a space looks different for you. And so I think this is for kind of both of the question and the comment to also just think about what you need to do to advocate for yourself. And if you are in a space where you're getting that pushback, you're feeling really emotional, like you're having trouble finding your words, I think it is absolutely okay to say, this is a really challenging conversation for me. And I need a minute. I need to step back. I need to go to the bathroom quickly. Maybe I just need to end this conversation right now and come back to it on a different day when I can have it. That is okay too. If your emotions are getting too overwhelming to have a productive conversation, then just acknowledge that, step away, and come back to the conversation if you can. And again, maybe you're not, maybe you can't go back to that conversation and you do need to tap a colleague or a supervisor or a community partner if it's a conversation worth continuing.
I love that, Megan.
All right. Fantastic. Thank you. I feel like that's a really solid place for us to also land of just like giving ourselves grace. We enter into the conversations, the hard ones, as our full selves, and those spaces might not always be safe or affirming. So for us to provide our sense of safety for ourselves, like to honor that, to give ourselves grace in this work, I think is really, really important and valuable, because the work that all of you are doing is incredibly challenging. It's really important, and it isn't easily done. Any closing thoughts from our wonderful panelists, Meghan, Brian, and La'Tanya? Want to make sure that you all get a chance to add anything if you'd like.
The thought that I kept thinking, and I'm sure everybody here knows this, but remember that every school district is required to have every 3 years a review of the human growth and development curriculum. And like, that's always a great way to have an impact as well, whether it's you on your free time or people that you know that should be part of that committee. Every school is required by law to do it. They don't always do it every 3 years, but that's another avenue for creating change within a school system.
Thank you so much, Brian. I see Meghan shared in the chat. Just thank you all for being here. I want to say thank you so much to the three of you, La'Tanya, Meghan, and Brian. Truly, thank you so much for sharing your experience and your wisdom with all of us as folks who have been in this line of work for so long, and with the knowledge and wisdom that you have. This was really invaluable. I know that pushback isn't a new phenomenon, but it feels particularly hostile as of late, especially against BIPOC folks, especially against LGBTQ folks, right? And all those who have intersections of identities. So you coming here and sharing your time with us, sharing your knowledge is so appreciated. We appreciate it so much, right? We have so much gratitude for that. Thank you all for coming and joining the panel. I hope that it was as enlightening to you as it was for me. With that, I'm happy to say thank you. Hopefully see you later at another WCASA event.